My name is Michael Newman. I'm the Chief Executive of the AJR, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this event this afternoon. One of the first events that we're doing as part of Refugee Week, which of course we're marking this week. The fact that you're all here suggests to me that you are a recipient of the AJR newsletter. That's how you heard about the event. And you'll know from today's edition that this is the start of Refugee Week, and this is our beginning of our contribution to that. There is a series of events that we're delighted to be presenting through the course of this week with our colleague Monica Byrne-Duchen, who I can also see is with us this afternoon. Hello, Monica. And there's a really excellent lineup of events planned for the rest of the week, tomorrow, Wednesday and Thursday, focusing tomorrow on art, refugee and renewal, migration in British art on Wednesday, Oh What a Life, followed by a discussion, and on Thursday, I'm sure some of you will have seen already, but fantastic, The Ballad of the Cosmo Cafe. So really it's our way of marking and paying homage to the refugees, and we mark Refugee Week at this time. And also directly connected to that is the subject that we'll be discussing today. And it gives me great pleasure. We haven't strayed too far from home today. This is very much a home match for the AJR. We have two AJR stalwarts with us for our discussion today. I'm delighted that my colleague Lewkowicz, the director of the AJR Refugee Voices Archive, is with us, and also Tony Grenville, who you will all know, former editor of the AJR, consultant editor of the AJR Journal, is with us to discuss really a subject that's directly close to the AJR's history and heart, the subject of internment, which of course led directly to the establishment of the AJR back in 1941, because of course we're at the moment marking the anniversary, the milestone anniversary of the beginning of internment, and that's really what we wanted to do today. Just an additional couple of housekeeping notes. I have, as you can see on your individual screens, I have muted everybody, and that's to save on the background noise for when the speakers are addressing everybody. We're going to divide the event into two parts. So in a moment, I'm going to ask Tony to speak first about internment, and then we will have a Q&A, a shortish Q&A session. And then I'm going to ask Bea to speak and to show a short film, and also to introduce a new microsite on the AJR Refugee Voices website, which really features a lot more detail about the subject of internment based on the interviews that we've collected in the Refugee Voices archive. So you'll get 2 bites, and then later on, time permitting, we'll come back with some more questions, perhaps for those who didn't get a chance after Tony, and also to Bea about the interviews that have been collected so far, and about the interviews that are featured part of the internment. What else do I have to tell you? Of course, being AJR members, you'll know that, of course, this is very much a part of our history and heritage. Our focus remains, of course, the social welfare provision of our members. And as I always do at these events, it's fantastic that we're able to put on these kind of events which speak to the history and the culture and the heritage of the organisation. But of course, should you know of anybody who could benefit from our social welfare services and activities, please do let us know in the office. We are still operating, albeit remotely, respecting the social distancing guidelines, but we are endeavouring to make sure that our members are provided for. That's our foremost concern at this time. So please do let us know. And of course, through the AJR newsletter, if you have ideas and suggestions for things. I know over the years, if one thing I've learned about AJR members is that they're not shy. or backward at coming forward with ideas and suggestions, and we welcome them all. So thank you very much. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Tony Grenville, the former editor of the AJR Journal, as I said, and also the chair of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies. And he's going to give a talk, an introductory talk, historical background to internment and a critical way in which it's been memorialised. Tony, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you all for coming and listening to me virtually. Now, when war broke out in September 1939, the British government wished to avoid interning enemy aliens en masse as it had in the First World War. So it set up tribunals, about 120 of them across the country, before which all German and Austrian nationals, including, of course, Germans that happened to be in Britain when war broke out and were quite likely sympathetic to the Hitler government, them as well. But the British government summoned all German nationals, of which the largest chunk were, of course, refugees. And the tribunals allocated them to one of three categories. Only a tiny minority, about 1%, mostly those with Nazi sympathies, that is probably Germans who were here, say, merchant seamen whose ships were in British ports, that sort of thing. They were allocated to category A, deemed an immediate danger and interned immediately. The vast majority of refugees were classed, quite properly, as victims of Nazi oppression and allocated to category C, which left them at liberty. Those whose cases the tribunals judged unclear were allocated to the intermediate category B and were left at liberty but subject to certain restrictions. There were somewhere over 70,000 people summoned before the tribunals, of whom about 65,000, so about 90% nearly, were category C, and about 6,000 plus were category B, with a few hundred category A. However, that was not to last, because in the early summer of 1940, the collapse of France brought the German army to the Channel within sight of the British coast, and the German Air Force within bombing range of Britain's cities. Under pressure from the right-wing press, increasingly hostile to the refugees, the government gave way to those who argued that the refugees posed a threat to national security as potential spies, agents for the Germans, and fifth columnists who might sabotage British defences as their counterparts supposedly had in the Low Countries and France. The newspapers that were prominent here were the usual suspects. Well, the Daily Sketch, which doesn't exist anymore, the Daily Mail, which does. And there were also sources like our ambassador in Holland, who, when he escaped from Holland to this country, gave an interview saying that the defences of the Dutch had been undermined by, there were these fanciful stories of German paratroopers posing as nuns and so on, because people, of course, found it very hard to understand how the British Army could be effectively kicked out of Europe in 3 weeks, whereas it had managed to last out over 4 years in the First World War. Responding to this pressure, the newly installed coalition government under Winston Churchill, which came into power on the 10th of May 1940, this government first decreed the internment of male enemy aliens, that's German nationals, which would include, of course, Austrian nationals, because Austria had been absorbed into Germany, not, however, those of Czech or Polish nationality. These were allies. So the government decreed the internment of male enemy aliens between 16 and 60, living in what were called protected areas on the threatened sectors of the coast, south and east coast, where there was a fear of invasion. This was followed shortly afterwards in May with Churchill's notorious order to collar the lot, in other words, to proceed with the mass internment of enemy aliens. The Category B internees had already been interned. Now, male refugees in Category B were interned, as were Category B women. A word here about the tribunals which had made these distinctions. It sounds all very neat, but in fact, the organization of the tribunals left a good deal to be desired. They were inconsistent across the country. They quite frequently, the members of the tribunals seem not really to have understood what they were doing, and they were given to arbitrary judgments. One example is the writer Robert Neumann, a very well-known writer back in Austria, who was living peacefully in Aylesbury, but, shock horror, living in sin with his girlfriend. This earned him, he was an obvious refugee from Nazi oppression, but this earned him a Category B categorization, and that in turn earned him internment early on in May. As my friend and colleague Richard Dove, a great expert on Neumann and other writers, put it very appositely, a clear case of guilt by cohabitation. So refugees in Category B, both male and female, were interned, and the detention of male refugees in Category C began in June and was underway when the policy of internment was halted the following month. Internment, to some extent, a panic response to the extreme situation of national emergency prevailing in May-June 1940, ultimately caused the internment of some 27,000 enemy aliens, including some 4,000 women, most of whom were Jews, Jewish refugees, who plainly posed no security whatsoever. The mass internment of enemy aliens in 1940 it's now generally agreed, indefensible. It was a measure that was as cruel and inhumane as it was stupid and pointless. The best that can be said for it is that it was an unthinking response taken in panic, with, of course, the Wehrmacht sitting in Calais and everybody fearing, not without reason, that the German army would be invading the country. Nobody knew that the Battle of Britain would turn out the way it did. So this is an unthinking response taken in panic, with little heed to the consequences for its victims, at a time of national obsession, largely irrational, with internal security risks, largely imaginary. To intern as potential Nazi sympathizers Jewish refugees who'd been the most prominent targets of Nazi persecution and had the greatest reason to oppose the Nazi regime was almost perversely insensitive. Among the worst aspects was the trauma that a fresh bout of detention inflicted on those of the internees who'd already experienced imprisonment in Nazi concentration camps, which were, of course, very, very much worse. The incompetence and inefficiency that characterized the entire episode were apparent from the outset. The process of arresting detainees was conducted with a combination of heartless bureaucracy and disorganized muddle. Most refugees were arrested at home, and after their arrest, they were held at temporary camps, like for the London area, the racecourses of Kempton Park and Lingfield, also, bizarrely enough, the winter quarters of Bertram Mills Circus at Ascot in Buckinghamshire. There were also other temporary internment camps in Edinburgh. The temporary camps were around the principal areas of population where the refugees were gathered. In Edinburgh, the composer Hans Gall was incarcerated in the grim surroundings of the Donaldson Hospital for Deaf Children, where he was shocked to find himself surrounded by barbed wire and armed sentries. Other refugees were sent to Seaton and Paynton in Devon. Conditions were very bad at Priest Heath in Shropshire, where internees lived under canvas despite the weather, and conditions were indescribable at Worth Mill, a disused cotton mill at Bury, Lancashire, where dirt, squalor, and lack of food and facilities reigned. We'll be hearing more about that later this afternoon. The chaos of these makeshift arrangements was matched by the disorganization of the entire exercise. The internees soon realized that the military authorities had no real idea why they'd been returned, what was to be done with them, and how long they were to be held. Some were detained in prison, in particular women, who were held at Holloway Prison in London. Women were presumably felt not to be able to tolerate conditions like that at Worth Mill and Priest Heath, so, which is reasonable enough, but not reasonable enough. They were then sent to Holloway. A contemporary account written by Ruth Borchardt appeared in 1942, so very soon after internment. It was reprinted more recently, gives a vivid account of what the women went through when they were locked up with, of course, ordinary criminals. The book is called We Are Strangers Here. Unfortunately, it breaks off when she arrives in the Isle of Man, so we don't see that part of her story. She must have had a very nasty time, though oddly enough, just the other day, I saw an interview with her granddaughter, who said that she thought her grandmother had rather enjoyed internment, though I must say my idea of a holiday camp is not Holloway Prison. Worst of all was the psychological blow of being unjustly imprisoned. The deprivation of liberty, the confinement and humiliation were made more wounding by the apparent willingness of the authorities to identify Jewish refugees with agents of Nazism. One British officer is said to have exclaimed, "I didn't realize there were so many Jews amongst the Nazis," which gives some indication, I think, of the level of education and information in this country relating to European matters. My parents, when they arrived here from Vienna, got used to people saying, "Where do you come from?" Answer, "Vienna." "Oh, that's where the canals are." Or if they said Austria, they said, "Oh, you must mean Australia," and so on. Now, the authorities soon started moving the internees from temporary camps to the Isle of Man, where, as in the First World War, they were to be held. They went via Liverpool, where the people greeted them with insults and missiles as they were marched through the streets to be shipped across to the Isle of Man. Of course, the citizens of Liverpool thought that these were Germans, German agents, and pro-Nazis. Many internees spent some time prior to embarkation at a makeshift camp at Huyton on Merseyside, a newly built council estate hastily and rather inadequately converted into a camp. On the Isle of Man, the internees were housed in camps in Douglas, Ramsey, Peel, and Russian, mostly in groups of boarding houses requisitioned for the purpose. Camp names like Central Promenade Camp, Hutchinson, Onken, Sefton, Moora, Peveril, and the Women's Camp, comprising Port Erin and Port St. Mary, became common usage amongst the refugees. Conditions in the camps on the Isle of Man were considerably better than in the temporary camps, not least because some semblance of order and stability could be established there. The internees lived in small groups in requisitioned individual boarding houses surrounded by barbed wire, where the food and accommodation was Spartan but adequate. Many refugees had to sleep 2 to a double bed. The summer months on the Isle of Man were pleasant and free from air raids. Walks in the country were gradually permitted under armed guard, as was swimming in the sea. There were adequate sanitary arrangements and some medical care. The camps were run through a system of self-administration by the internees, though under the close control of British military command. This allowed the internees to develop one of the most notable features of the internment camps, a remarkable array of cultural activities, including concerts, lecture courses, and other educational activities organized by so-called camp universities, and even a musical revue called What a Life, staged in Central Promenade Camp to music by Hans Gahl. The galaxy of academic, musical, and artistic talent available in the internment camps made for a wide and attractive selection of lectures for those eager to put their enforced idleness to good use. The women's camp, which was considerably smaller than all the men's camp, there was then subsequently a family camp because some women arrived with children, and eventually the authorities had the good sense and humanity to arrange family camps. We interviewed back in the 1990s at our Research Center for German and Austrian Exile Studies some 34 former refugees for a book that we subsequently wrote called Changing Countries. And one of the first we interviewed had actually given birth in internment by herself, though she was later joined by her husband. She then became the German tutor of my friend and colleague, Professor Charmian Brinson, who is largely through her the teacher's inspiration studied German and has become one of the great experts on aspects of the refugee experience, not least the women's internment camps. The emotional and psychological impact of detention remained powerful and hurtful. The internees were confined on an island remote from the mainland cities, far from their families whose safety was at serious risk from German bombing, and who'd been deprived of their main breadwinner. Cut off from reliable sources of news by the censorship, the internees fell prey to all sorts of rumors and fears, not least that Britain would surrender and hand them over to the Nazis, quote, like rats in a trap, as had indeed happened in France. This was the cause of a lot of severe psychological anxiety, including some suicide, because many people expected, of course, that the Germans would invade, and that would have been effectively a death sentence, of course, for interned refugees. The difficulty of communicating with the outside world, especially the long delays to which letters and telegrams to families were subject, was a source of great frustration. The military administration had erected its own impenetrable barriers of procedure and bureaucracy between the refugees and the outside world, making it very difficult, for example, for refugees to set about securing their release. Such arbitrary inefficiency was one of the aspects of camp life that relentlessly ground down the internees' morale. They were also confined for an indefinite period in a very definite and restricted space, and I always think that this asymmetry must have added to the psychological burden of internment. You were surrounded by barbed wire, you couldn't escape the view of barbed wire, and yet you were confined for an indefinite period, not like a criminal who has a sentence, even if it's a life sentence, not like a prisoner of war who knows he's going to be released at the end of the war. You're kept hanging on a string, as it were. You could be released tomorrow, you could be interned indefinitely. The government took the process a stage further when it started to deport internees overseas. 4 ships carrying some 4,400 men sailed to Canada. 3 of them arrived, the Ettrick, the Sobieski, and the Duchess of York. The men were held in Canada in camps in places like Sherbrooke and Trois-Rivières in Quebec. Some 2,400 men were sent to Australia on the ill-famed SS Dunera, HMT, His Majesty's troop ship, Dunera, a ship on which conditions were extremely poor and where the internees were robbed and seriously mistreated. Worse still, on the 2nd of July 1940, the Arandora Star, a liner bound for Canada, was sunk off the Irish coast with the loss of several hundred lives, mostly German and Italian deportees and British crew members. This was a requisitioned liner, Blue Star liner. Though the government first claimed that all Germans on board had been Category A internees, it soon became known that many of the dead were Jewish refugees in Category C. The resulting furore crystallized opposition to internment and led to a determined campaign against it in Parliament, culminating in a celebrated debate on the 22nd of August 1940 as German bombs fell on the capital. By then, public opinion had swung sharply against internment, and the government had reversed its policy, issuing a white paper in late July listing a variety of categories of internees eligible for priority release. These categories were widened over the following months. The release of the interned refugees proceeded reasonably speedily in some cases, those who had expertise that would benefit the war effort, those who were elderly or in health, or in ill health, or who had influential voices speaking on their behalf. The release process was, however, the cause of great frustration. I have the letters written home by my aunt's first husband. I can't call him my uncle because unfortunately he died before I was born. His name was Otto Gross, and he suffered very greatly. He was interned for about 9 months. He had a heart condition. He was elderly. His family were trapped in Europe and he never saw them again. And internment was pretty dreadful for him. The first 50 men were released from the Isle of Man as early as the 5th of August 1940. Hans Gall was released in September 1940, Neumann, Robert Neumann as well, though more refugees were detained until late 1940 or early 41. The artist and writer Fred Ullman, author of the autobiography The Making of an Englishman, a splendid title, was released just in time for New Year 1941. By August 1941, only about 1,300 refugees were still interned in Britain, while many of those deported overseas had returned, often to join the armed forces. Internment aroused widely differing reactions, and the judgments passed on it have also varied greatly. Many of the younger refugees, single men, recalled the months spent on the Isle of Man almost as a kind of enforced holiday to which they reconciled themselves once they'd accustomed themselves to it. Its restrictions were irksome, but they felt able to take them in their stride. Older refugees, concerned about their families, found the anxieties and humiliation of imprisonment, especially completely unwarranted imprisonment, harder to bear. Some experienced serious mental crises. Some refugees, generous in spirit, went so far as to defend internment as an understandable measure, not incommensurate with the national emergency facing Britain in 1940. More common was the view that internment was a wholly misconceived, unjust and stupid measure taken in panic and implemented inefficiently, but that events had soon caused the government to reconsider and reverse its policy, and that relatively little serious damage had been done. Even when the nation was fighting for survival, British liberalism had, in this view, reasserted itself. However, it remains a fact that some refugees retained a lasting sense of grievance, and there was a division amidst the refugee community here. In my experience, and I've come across a lot of reactions to internment, the refugees lean surprisingly heavily towards a sort of rather forgive and forget attitude. That differentiates them very sharply from most historians, British historians. Anglo-Jewish historians and left-wing historians critical of the British in particular. And this is an interesting division. I incline myself towards the refugee side, and therefore something of an outsider in this respect in the historical community. If one looks at the internment diaries of people like Robert Neumann and Fred Ullman, one sees that they suffered, and it's plain from the diaries that they didn't suffer physically, but they suffered psychologically. However, in later text, autobiographical texts that they wrote, the degree of suffering and the anger at internment is much toned down. Now, historians frequently say, well, this is because they are trying to show their gratitude to the British, or they're afraid of upsetting the British. That cannot be the case with these two. These are probably the best known cases of people who wrote about internment at the time in diaries, and then later, Ullman in fact 3 times. Robert Neumann went back to Switzerland in the 1950s, so he didn't have to bother about the British at all when he wrote his autobiography, Ein leichtes Leben, an easy life. Ullman was also in a position not to worry because he'd married the daughter of an aristocrat and a government minister, Lord Croft, a right-winger and someone who never reconciled himself to his daughter's marriage. But Ullman lived in a protected and privileged position. He was fortunate enough to live in what is my favorite street in Hampstead, Downshire Hill, if those that know it. Ullman, at the end of his autobiography, The Making of an Englishman, declared Britain to be a heaven and a haven. This phrase upset one historian, the late Bill Williams, great historian of Manchester Jewry, who said that Ullman can only have meant it when he talked about internment by comparison with Auschwitz. However, that is a misrepresentation of what Ullman actually wrote. Ullman compared Britain not with Auschwitz, but with France, a country he actually loved. He'd spent 3 years there when he first left Germany in 1933. It's difficult to say which of these texts one should rely on. Is the immediate response the more authentic, or the later, more considered research in a way more accurate? If you look at the texts, published texts, that were written immediately after internment, during the war or soon afterwards, they are also texts by refugees. They are also surprisingly positive about the British. The first reactions were uniformly negative, of course. But if one looks at Alfred Lomnitz's Never Mind, Mr. Lom, Eugen Speer's The Protecting Power, that is God, in his case, or Richard Friedenthal's Die Welt in der Nussschale, The World in a Nutshell, the nutshell being the shape of the Isle of Man, you get a predominantly forgiving approach to internment. And the reason for that, I think, is that all these 3 texts, and they're the most often commented on, all of them continue after internment into the wartime period. And the wartime period had the most enormous impact on the refugees because they were in Britain, in the front line, as it were, alongside the rest of the civilian population, resisting the Nazis and building up a considerable admiration for the British people in their defiance of Hitler and his wretched Luftwaffe. The refugees in Germany and Austria had, after all, seen the Nazis go from an insignificant right-wing sect to the largest political party in the country, to taking over the country, first Germany, then the Rhineland remilitarized, the occupation of Austria entire, of the Sudetenland part of Czechoslovakia, the rest of Czechoslovakia, all peacefully. And then when war broke out, Hitler's army swept across most of mainland Europe. It was not until the Battle of Britain and the speeches of Winston Churchill that Hitler received his first setback. And that, I think, was psychologically of enormous, almost incalculable importance to the refugees. And I think that it set the rails, the tracks for their later attitude to Britain. I'm not saying all of them by any means. I know that there are refugees, and certainly the children of refugees, who maintain that the British behaved badly to the refugees generally, and in the case of internment in particular. For many refugees, however, the rest of their long stay, in many cases lasting decades, their settlement in Britain, seems to me to have outweighed that, the damage done by internment. That is a personal, and not only a personal point of view, it's a point of view backed up by an awful lot of research, of speaking to people, of interviewing people, and of reading, well, probably hundreds rather than dozens of accounts. Some people will probably not agree with it, and of course I will be very happy to answer questions and listen to any disagreements. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very, very much, Tony. As ever, that was a masterly run through of a fascinating period in British history directly connected with the refugee experience. And like everybody else here, I'm really grateful for you for going into that detailed analysis for that episode. Just before we open it up to questions on what you've just said there, we are in a few minutes going to go over to Bea Lewkowicz, who's going to do part 2 of today's proceedings. But just before we open up the floor, just to clarify something I said earlier about one or two of the other events that are happening this week. In fact, Tony, you mentioned, for example, Wolf Mills. These are events being staged by our colleagues, Insiders Outsiders Festival. Man and Monica's on the event today with us, and we're delighted to partner with them. We've been a supporter of the festival over the last 18 months or so, and clearly there's a meeting of minds when it comes to these subjects. So thank you for indulging us further with the opportunity to partner with you again. So we do have a few minutes now. If people have questions directly on what Tony was just talking about, here's a chance now. We will come back later on for a second round, but if people have a burning question, then please either raise your hand or send a message directly on the chat. Diana DeCosta. Diana, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, my father was on the Danera, and the one thing I can't quite get my head round is how not everybody ended up on the Danera. So how were they actually selected? Was it mainly people from the southeast, from London and round there, or did they come from all different camps everywhere else, or were there other criteria? I've never actually understood how he actually ended up on it.
Oh well, they didn't come from the southeast. They were already concentrated up in on Merseyside and in the Isle of Man, so they would come from all over the country. And the selections made, they were on the Isle of Man. The selections made were very random, really, because the camp authorities were simply told by the government, look, the Canadians and the Australians will take so many thousand people. You've got to fill the quota. So of course they on the whole tried first of all to cajole people into, or even bribe people into going. Some people were quite happy to go and thought, well, things would be better in Canada and Australia. Little did they know. Some of them thought that they were promised that their families would follow. And sometimes the camp authorities, with the assistance of the refugee sort of officials who ran the various huts and streets and the so-called camp, Lager Ältester, camp fathers, simply filled the quotas as best they could. I suspect sometimes by putting people on the list they wanted to get rid of. And so it was very much a rag bag. But they were selected from the internment camps, not from London and the southeast or any other regions. I don't know if that helps. It's as clear as mud how they were chosen, and it was not at all a creditable process.
When you say camp leaders, do you mean they were part of the group who were organising the camps? You mean
in a way, yes. As I
fellow refugees?
Yes, in a way. The British, as I said, organised the camp, allowed an element of self-administration in the camp. So each house had its house father, House Ältester. Each street then had its street father, and so on up to the camp fathers. And they, according to the sources I've read, played a part in drawing up these lists. There's a obviously fictional and very sharp portrayal of this in a novel by a man called a refugee called Leo Kahn, called Obliging Fellow, which shows how an absolute rascal called Raffleson works his way up to being camp father before he's then released. And he plays a part in helping to select other inmates. I don't know to what extent this happened, because Leo Kahn's novel is a satirical novel and not reliable. But it's certainly one of the less credible.
I'm going to jump in. I'm sorry, my connection was a bit unstable there. I'm going to jump in here because I'm conscious of time. We do have another speaker, of course, today, which is Bear Lewkowicz, who's going to talk a little about the Refugee Voices Archive. And then if there's time after, we will come back for some more questions. So Bear, can I hand over to you now, please?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. I'm Bear Lewkowicz, Director of the AJR Refugee Voices Archive, and I'll be talking to you briefly about the archive and the story of the internment of the German-Austrian refugees, thank you, during World War II, which continues, of course, to resonate today. We are at the beginning of Refugee Week 2020, and it's the 80th anniversary of the mass internment of the Jewish refugees, which, as Tony said, started in June 1940. So it seems very fitting that we're launching a dedicated internment microsite and a new short film with testimonies from 3 women who've been interned on the Isle of Man in 1940. It's interesting that the story of British internment is not so well known. I came across first properly when I was working at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York in early 2001, and I was handling a pamphlet called What a Life, which was mentioned before, which was a camp review with music by Hans Gall, and that features later in the week. In the interviews I conducted later for the Continental Britain's exhibition, internment featured very prominently. Norbert Breinin met his later Amadeus Quartet colleague Peter Schidlow in internment. One of Sigmund Freud's grandson, Anton Walter Freud, was interned as a 16-year-old schoolboy and sent onto the Dunera to Australia. And Ludwig Spiro talked about being a camp supervisor at Onken Camp. Now, We created the Refugee Archive in 2003, and we knew that internment is an important part of the refugee experience in Britain. And up to today, we have interviewed 25 people who experience internment. And I should say that this also includes internment, Japanese internment in Shanghai, and one woman who was interned in Algeria. Of course, we have many more interviewees whose fathers or brothers were interned. One tragic example is the case of Natalie Haas-Smickler, who lost both her brothers as their boat coming back from internment in Australia was torpedoed and sunk. So let me say something briefly about the archive. And next slide, please. Yeah. Our archive is unique for a few reasons. The first, and you can see this here, we were the first British video testimony archive of survivors and refugees. The second point is we focus on the whole life history of an individual and not only on their wartime experiences. And thirdly, and you can see this in the slide, we started interviewing in 2003. So we managed to interview still a large number of individuals who came to Britain as young adults. And in fact, the number of people who were born before 1920 is 54. So we have 54 people in the archive who were born before 1920. And fourthly, and that's quite important, we also, apart from the testimonies, we capture photographs and documents. And at the moment, we have more than 3,500 photographs and documents in our archive. So as you can imagine, one of the challenges of an archive of this size is how to best access the many hours of interview. So we created a website last year. Next slide, please. Which is more a research platform, because you can search the interviews by place of birth, place of residence, and age. What was missing was to categorize everyone by their experiences so that you can look at the groups of interviews together. And one of the results for us of the COVID lockdown, where we had more time, was that we have now managed to digitally attribute every interviewee certain experiences. For example, kinder transport, in hiding, or relevant for today, internment. And thank you for Susanna Kliemann for carrying out this very difficult task. Next slide, please. And this, when you go to our website, and please go to our website, ajrrefugeevoices.org.uk, you can come to this, and it really, we think it really is revolutionized the access to our interviews, because you can see here we categorize them in pre-war, wartime, wartime in Britain, and post-war, and you can go by experience, and that takes you to different interviews. And also, because we have now categorized people this way, we can now create microsites where interviewees with similar experiences appear together. And our first microsite was actually on concentration camp survivors on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the camp liberations. Our second microsite is on refugee internment. Next slide, please, which we're launching today. One more, please. Yeah, and on that side, you'll be able to see all the 25 interviewees who were interned. And I think one of them, Mr. Fred Stern, is here with us today, so welcome. Now, we have 15 men and women who were interned on the Isle of Man, 3 who were sent on the Dunera to Australia, and 3 men were sent to Canada. At the moment, we have the camp names as here listed, as they were referred to in the interviews. So the women, for example, were interned, as Tony mentioned before, in 2 places, Port St. Mary and Port Erin, but the camp name was actually Russian, but that is not mentioned by the interviewees. So at the moment, we don't refer to it. So it is still a work in progress. The family camp was set up in the Hotel Balaquini, and 2 interviewees, Edna Sovin and Elisa Dool, were there with their parents. Soon you'll be able to see the relevant photos and documents on the site, and hopefully we will develop the site further by putting in maps and more information. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to give you an example. Yeah, next slide, please. And here are just some of the examples of the documents I mentioned and the photographs. So these are 2 documents which we captured by Edna Sovin, And this is on the left, you can see the Hotel Balaquini and in a drawing, and you can read, who can read German? Tanzwettbewerb is a competition for the best waltz. And in the interview, she says she was a child at the time that she was somehow involved in creating this little poster. On the right, you can see something which was given to her, I think it was her grandfather, with heartfelt thanks to Guy Beermann. And that was given to her grandfather, and it's in her archive today. And what I find very touching, it says, you can read it, it was terribly energy and wishing you help to overcome the darkest hours. And you know, this contrast a little bit to how the interviewee is portrayed, and it refers to what Tony said, there is a slight gap between documents from the time and later interviews. And the next slide, please. Yes, and here you can see some more. So on the left, some of you might know this, this is a portrait of Klaus Hinrichsen, who we interviewed by Kurt Schwitters. And Kurt Hinrichsen became a sort of art historian later who did quite a lot about art and internment. So this is the wonderful portrait of him. And the other things, this refers to interviewees whose fathers were interned, and these are the release papers which are now in our archive. One is by Henry Ebner, and the other one is by Joe Ferraggio, his fathers. The fathers were released. And yeah, next slide, please. So I will now, I hope this technology will work, and we're going to be able to show you a short film, which are made on the experiences of the women, not yet, 1 second, of the women who were interned. But I'd like to just say a few things before we watch. The different ages point us to the different experiences of internment. Margaret Simmons, on the left, was an adult, and in fact, she's the oldest interviewee in our archive. She was born in 1906. In fact, she had to leave her own son behind in Germany. She was married to a non-Jewish German, and she emigrated, but she couldn't take her son with her. So she was interned, and her second husband was also interned on the Isle of Man in a men's camp. Ellen Schiffman, on the right, was a schoolgirl who was interned when she turned 16, and she was separated from her parents. And in the interview, she says that she was the first person to leave the Isle of Man after 6 weeks. And the third person is Elise Duhl, who was first with her mother, and then in a family camp with her father in the very Hotel Balaquini. And they remember the internment on the whole as a positive experience, although I'm sure that Ellen Schiffman's situation must have been the most difficult one, being separated from her father and literally being taken from her own school. The women's internment was different from the men's, as the women's camp was run by the landladies, not by the military, and that made a big difference. So the women were, for example, not in charge of their own cooking, while they were doing other things, while the men had to organize really the camp themselves. And of course, for the women, there was a difference, as the Nazi sympathizers and Jewish refugees were sometimes in very close proximity. But that's maybe something we can discuss a bit further. So now let's hope the technology works and we can watch the film and find out how the three women in our archive recall their experiences.
Well, there was one magistrate whose name I have forgotten, and Mrs. Kahn, who worked in Wobernhaus, and somebody else, the third person, who I've forgotten. And I was classified B, and later Mrs. Kahn told me that the magistrate asked her, what have the Jews done in Germany that they are so unpopular? So that proves that they hadn't got a clue what was going on. And a few weeks later, I have a policeman called at the flat and told me I had to be at Pinner police station at a certain time. and bring enough luggage to prepare for a stay or something. The first night we were taken by coach to Fulham, to some enormous hall which was full of beds, and stayed one night there. The next day we went by train to Liverpool, where the population was very hostile and threatened us, as probably Nazis or Germans. And then we spent the night on a ship taking us to the Isle of Man. And I was approached by a very nice lady who collected a circle around herself, a Mrs. Cosman, and we all went to the same hotel in Port Erin. And the first thing I saw when we went through that hotel, that there were double beds in the rooms, and I was horrified. I didn't want to share a double bed with some stranger. So I looked quickly through the hotel and asked the owner, the woman, whether they didn't have any single rooms. And she said, well, there is one, but it's very small. And I said, never mind how small it is, I'll have it. And immediately occupied the single room. It was tiny. I had to be on my knees to be able to look out of the window, of a little window, but it had a bed and a washstand, and that was heaven. But then we made friends, and we had quite a good time. We had very few duties, just to lay the table and to clear it and do the washing up. That went in a routine around. Everybody had to do it at some time. And there were several people who gave lectures. I learned to make gloves and took Spanish lessons. And so there was one house for the Nazis. I think there were sisters of a hospital in London, German women, but we never met them or had any contact with them. There was a group of gardeners. I should have joined, but I never did. And it wasn't boring and it wasn't not terribly interesting. Then I stayed a very, very cold winter there, and was released on the 22nd of March, after a year. That was when was it, 42, I suppose. Yeah. Everybody else was interned, so I'm not an emotional type. I don't get terribly upset or terribly joyful or anything like that. I have a good sense of humor. I take things as they come.
In 1940, on my 16th birthday, when I came home from school, the lady next door, who was in the WVS, came with a power of arrest and took me away to be interned, leaving my parents behind. And they took us to a place in Derby, where we stayed overnight. And then they took us to Liverpool Lime Street. When we emerged, angry crowds lining the street, because there were these terrible Germans coming out of the station, and we were marched to the docks where they'd opened an old sailor's home that hadn't been used for 5 years, and they kept us there overnight. And it was just terrible, because there was some flooding, and we had filthy, dirty mattresses. There was no food. But I forget. As we were marched to this place, the local Liverpudlians were throwing stones at us because they were ignorant. They didn't know. They thought we were all Nazis. Anyhow, we got to this place, and I must say they had policemen there, and there was a very kind policeman, and he went home, never forget that, and brought me a piece of apple pie that his wife had baked. He felt so sorry for me. And the next day we were put on the boat to the Isle of Man. And we were housed in the boarding houses that had all been vacated by holidaymakers. And the landlady received from the government for people over 18, £1 a week, and for people under 18, 10 shillings. And so more or less on half rations if you were under 18 when you have a very good appetite. The others got more. But apart from that, it was more like a holiday, really. Lovely weather. We were allowed to roam around Port Erin. And I can't say that we were ill-treated or anything like that, you know. It was just difficult being away from home. My headmistress and the Chief Constable of Leicester made a special application to the Home Office, and they released me after 6 weeks, and I was the first person to be released from the Isle of Man. Now, while I was there and I was due to sit the O-levels, my school had sent me all my revision books and everything, and I spent a lot of the time revising, whereas probably if I'd been at school I wouldn't have done so much. And I came out 2 weeks before the O-levels, and when I took the exams, mine were the best. I was in the school, so, you know, the revision had done me a lot of good. But, you know, I can only say that they were absolutely marvellous. Especially the headmistress, and for the Chief Constable to put in an application.
We also went to the Isle of Man, where I spent 2 years. From 1940 to 42. It was 4 hours travelling on the boat from London to Liverpool. That's right. No, from Liverpool to the Isle of Man. Oh, we got to Liverpool by train, obviously. We wanted to join Daddy, didn't we? Who was there already. Who was in a man's camp in Ramsey in Isle of Man. But when the family came, there was a family camp. It was called the Bella Queenie Hotel in St Mary's in the Isle of Man. And we joined there. It was a proper hotel, a very big hotel, yeah, one of the biggest there. And it was, as I say, it was called St Mary's, and there were facilities for school in the hotel. They made up, you know, a school for the children. And as I say, they had these kosher sections which we were in. And I went to the school. There were several children there, and they made up a school for us, and everything was barbed wired because you couldn't run out to the sea in case you swam to Ireland. A few people did that to escape. I mean, they weren't badly treated. It was just a matter of being hemmed in with big barbed wire things, you know. I was happy. I mean, it was sunshine, it was beautiful weather. I was quite happy there, being there with my parents, you know, and in safety, so to speak.
Thank you very much, Bea. Was there anything you wanted to add at the end, or should we quickly open the floor back for some questions? Because I'm conscious that there's one of the Inside-Outsider Festival events at 5 o'clock today that some people might also be going along to.
Open the floor.
So Open the floor, yeah?
Battery
Yep.
media.
Say we've got about 10 minutes or so. So if you want to put your hands up again, or if colleagues can let me know if there were people wishing to ask a question, we'll try to get to as many as possible. Okay, Peter, you ready to try again?
Yep, I think I can now. I've unmuted, have I?
You have, indeed.
Oh, well, okay.
Off you go.
I wanted to ask, was there any separation of the groups A, B and C when they were interned, or were they all intermingled? That's question one. Secondly, Anthony mentioned restrictions on category B not being to before they were interned. What were those restrictions? And thirdly, what do we know what percentage of people didn't come back when they were sent across to Canada and Australia and so on? Thank you.
Right.
Now,
Tony?
the category A people were, of course, interned separately because they were interned much earlier. They were interned in September 1939. And a particular, those were Germans, but also interned in spring 1940 were British fascists, Oswald Mosley most notably. He was kept separately. The category B and C internees were held indistinguishably. They were held together. Just the category B people were interned earlier. And as Bayer said, especially in the women's camps, there was some mixing, unfortunately, of Jewish refugees and Nazis. On the whole, there wasn't in the men's camps. Because at first, in September 39, there were hardly any of the Jewish refugees, very, very few who were interned actually by mistake, mistakenly categorized category A. They were the only ones. Eugen Speer, the author of the book, The Protecting Power, was one of those unfortunates who was interned with a lot of Nazis. Sorry, now the question of how many came back from to this country from Canada and Australia, the answer is I'm not quite sure. And I don't know if anybody has done a check on that. I've not seen any figures. But I would say at an estimate that probably more came back. The reason being that people wanted to fight, and of course you couldn't fight the Nazis from Australia or Canada really. Quite a lot stayed, but I think more came back. Not many more, but I would say the bigger half. I've forgotten the middle question.
What were the restrictions on category B?
The restrictions on category B people. It was things like they weren't allowed to own cameras and motor cars, and they had to report to the police if they left the area that they were resident in.
Can you turn your sound off? Because
Hang on. One second. Where's?
Can I say also? I think I think the category B. One of the interviews was category B, Margaret Simmons, and I think she was probably mixing with the other categories in the women's camp, but possibly stayed longer. Maybe it was more difficult to be released.
I don't know. I don't know if being category B or C had any effect on that. I've not heard that it did. But then the release procedures were so Byzantine.
Yeah, arbitrary.
You would have thought it would, but...
Thank you both. Can I bring in Alan?
yes.
Morgan?
Can you hear me? In answer to the question of how many people came back from Canada and Australia, in both cases, about 40% stayed in Canada and 40% in Australia. The reasons for people coming back were different. those that wanted to re-emigrate to the USA, neither of them could go direct from Australia or Canada, had to come back to the UK. And the reasons for staying in Australia were more down to the fact that they couldn't get shipping back after Japan had entered the war. And the release categories in Canada were more liberal than in Australia, so a lot of the youngsters were allowed to stay in Canada and continue their education.
Can you just share, Alan, where did you source that from?
I have spent 10 years actually researching initially the Dunera experience. My father was on the Dunera, and recently I've created a database for those in Australia, and I'm also working on a database for those in Canada. There's a document in the Canadian Archives which details approximately 2,500 so-called friendly aliens that came back from Canada, and details whether they stayed in Canada or came back to the UK. And I think from memory, 38% of them stayed in Canada.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay, thank you for that, Alan, and thank you, Peter, for your questions. A couple more minutes if anybody else has any. Andrew Kaufman.
Yes, just a slightly different question. My grandfather was interned for the whole of the First World War as an enemy alien on the Isle of Man. And I remember him telling me that he had a great time there. He read a lot of books, went to the university there and played a lot of tennis. But do you know anything about the First World War internment?
Not very much, probably not much more than you do, I'm afraid. All I know is that the British interned the German nationals and Austro-Hungarian nationals en masse, and as far as I know, kept them locked up more or less for the duration, and didn't release them. I know that the British civilians in Germany were treated likewise. They were mostly locked up at a place called Ruhleben near Berlin. But much more than that, I don't know.
No, he was there the whole of the whole of the 4 years.
They didn't release many.
Yeah, Andrew, can I say something to this? It's quite interesting. We have somebody in the archive whose father was interned during First World War I, and he was interned in World War II. Susie Kleeman. Susie, are you here? Maybe you can add, there's a wonderful story about this in the archive. Michael, can you see Susanne Kleeman? Can you unmute her? She's here.
Scanning across here. She was, oh yeah, here you are. Hang on 1 second. Let me unmute you. Okay. Oh, 1 second, Suzanne, hang on. You might have to do it yourself as well. Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Did you hear, Susie, what I said? That
yes,
story.
I did hear what you said. I'll look for the guy's name, but yes, he was interned during World War II, and his father had been interned during World War I. His father had been part of a traveling gymnastics trio who were performing in Britain just as World War I was occurred, and they were all interned. And his father spent the entirety of World War I in a prison camp in the Isle of Man with Joseph Pilates, possibly, who was there in World War I Isle of Man intern camp. And yes, and this, if you give me 1 moment, I'll have a look and I'll tell you who it was. Hold on.
So it seems an incredible story that within two generations, you know, they were interned in the same place in 2 world wars. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it?
Is the subject of internment in the First World War the subject of research in the same way as the Second World War?
Oh, there's a lot of it, yes. There's a lot of it. There are historians of the German community. I mean, one shouldn't forget that the internment and the accompanying hostility destroyed what was a very large German community in this country. There's an academic called Panikos Panayi who's done a big history of the German community, which is very large and flourishing in London. Lots of waiters and sugar bakers. And that was completely destroyed by the First World War, rather like the Italian community was heavily damaged by the internment of the Second World War.
Mm. Can I just add one thing? I don't know whether you've noticed one of the ladies talking about the kosher section. I mean, to me, that is incredible that, you know, on the Isle of Man, they were definitely had synagogue services, and there was some provisions or understanding of Orthodox families who ate separately to others. We have a few interviewees talking about that.
I believe they had separate houses.
And separate, yes.
Separate men's houses because of the cooking. Made sense.
It was the...
Sorry?
Sorry, it's the same, you know, in Australia, in Hay Camp, there was also a kosher section.
Interesting.
Really interesting.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question if anybody wants to ask. And just have a quick look across. Yes, Gail. You want to unmute yourself as well? Gail, if you want to unmute yourself. In the bottom left should be a mute button.
Okay.
Off you go.
Yeah.
I grew up in Canada, but my father was interned in Peveril on the Isle of Man for about a year. And he, I don't know if I've ever interacted with you and provided any records, or would you have records of him, or do I need to send them to you?
Well, unfortunately or fortunately, our archive is an oral history archive, so we only have records of the people we interview.
Oh, I see. Okay. So are you interested in getting names of people who were interned, or how do you?
No, I think the best place is the Wiener Library, because they are really collecting this sort of material in the UK. And we collect if it's related to the actual interviewee.
And the Manx Memorial Museum.
And the Manx Memorial Museum on the Isle of Man itself.
That is quite right.
Oh, they have information about or they want the names? I mean, I'm sure he was, you know, a teenager, and I don't think he was somebody that, he actually lost all his material belongings because they were stolen around the time that he got interned. So I don't think there was a lot of information about him anywhere, but I can provide it. I mean, I do have his release document.
I definitely... Actually, I would contact the Wiener Library or the Munks Museum on the Isle of Man.
I see. Okay, great. Thanks.
The biggest resource for details of those who were interned and who weren't interned is now at the National Archives at Kew.
That's awesome,
and a lot of that has now been digitized by findmypast and ancestry.com. So providing you subscribe to either of those, then you can go in and look at slightly restricted access to the aliens record cards and internment records. They're not well described in summary, but if you're doing it as an individual looking for a person, that's the way they've organized them, so you can find them quite easily.
I see. But the thing is, so that would be the same as what I have at home. That would potentially, they have a copy and I have a copy.
Yeah, they can't. You can't send material to National Archives, obviously.
No, they already have it. Okay, I'll look in Ancestry. That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to squeeze in one more question that I can see on the chat, and then we'll have to leave it there. From Rachel. Was there ever an attempt by former internees to obtain compensation from the government for their internment? Tony, do you know?
Interesting.
I know of. I don't think they have any claim. What the government did was lawful, and I know of no attempt to do that.
There certainly wasn't anything. There was no reparations scheme offered by the government, obviously. No.
I think there was from the Danera, but all the possessions that they lost.
That may well be. That yes, because there was a commission of inquiry, a court of inquiry, court martial. The officer in command was court martialed and subordinates, and I believe because their possessions were actually stolen en masse, and I think there was restitution there. But Alan Morganrope would know more about that than I do.
And I think also it would have been unlikely, because I think you have to, especially when it comes to interviews, contextualize the trauma. And as Tony said, there's so many other things which happened that maybe that was a smaller part of people's lives than the other events.
There was, as Diana rightly says, compensation for the losses on the Dunera and also on the Ettrick going out to Canada. They were robbed by the Canadians when they arrived. There's also a file in the archives which details quite large compensation for a group of British nationals who perhaps had joint nationality who were wrongly interned. But in terms of general compensation for internment, no, it was legal and there was no right of compensation whatsoever.
I have to stop it there because I'm conscious that we're going to be running into the event starting at 5 o'clock. So I'm very grateful impromptu for the contributions from Alan and Gail and Peter and others who asked questions, and also of course to Bea and Tony for sharing your fascinating, and Suzanne of course for sharing your fascinating insights and the collective wisdom. And I greatly appreciate it. I hope you all found the event interesting and fascinating as I did. And you can stay where you are because there's another event coming over in a couple of minutes. A couple of people who I saw participating today, Anna Nyberg and Dr. Rachel Pistol, will be accompanying Monica von Duchen to discuss the Wharf Mills aspect or episode connected with internment. And with that, I will say farewell from this event and hope to see you at future AJR events and enjoy the other outsider festival events during this Refugee Week. Be well, stay safe, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Oh, and thanks to my colleague Alex for his technical help.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex.